Yeah, Lynn's saying that we could copy the chat. No, the thing is, when people chat during the webinar, you can see what they're saying. The participants can see what they're saying. But when people make comments on the live stream, we in the webinar don't see what they're saying unless we keep two windows open, like one for YouTube and one for this. I'm going to start recording now, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're live, by the way.
Yeah, we are 2 minutes away, so we will start. We'll give people a couple of extra minutes to join.
So can you hear the participants, Radhika?
Yes, we can hear. Hi, Gary.
Hi.
We can hear you, but I will, of course, be requesting everyone to mute themselves once we get going. But yes, and in fact, participants will be able to ask questions at the end of the presentations.
Okay.
The main reason we asked usually participants to mute themselves is you often get some very funny echo effects, or their dogs walk in, or the kids start sending accidental messages, you know. So it's best if everybody except the participants as
except the speaker.
The speakers.
Yes, no, it makes perfect sense. I'm going to turn mine off.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Radhika Desai, and I'm going to be moderating this event, and we'll just wait for a couple more minutes to get people in, and then we will start.
Lynn is just saying, can we do Q&A? So, and use the Q&A for the questions, which is a sensible proposal.
I'm not sure we have it. I think the Q&A only appears in webinars.
Ah, I see.
And we are just doing a meeting at the moment. Okay, where was I? So everybody is recording and live streaming. That's good. So just so the speakers know, I'm still waiting for Ndongo. So if Ndongo doesn't show up, then there will be a slight...
He's here. I see him.
Excellent. Oh, brilliant. That's great. What a relief. Very good. Okay. Well, perhaps we should get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest of the Zoom events organized by the International Manifesto Group. Today's topic, as you all know, is the return of inflation, perceptions, realities, politics. My name is Radhika Desai, and I'm convener of the International Manifesto Group, and I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg in Canada, which stands on the stolen lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. This event is sponsored by the International Manifesto Group, which was created as a discussion group at the start of the pandemic to discuss the unfolding of the broader economic, social, and political and international crises that the pandemic had clearly accelerated. Since then, we have written a manifesto, which is entitled Through Pluripolarity Towards Socialism, which I encourage everyone to read, sign, perhaps tell your friends about it, and also to donate and volunteer. It has also been a volunteer with us in the activities of the International Manifesto Group. The manifesto has already been translated into about 15 languages, and more are awaited. You can find more information at the International Manifesto, all one word, .org. So let's get on to the topic of the day. Inflation has made a big comeback after nearly 4 decades of neoliberalism, and we think this is a pretty big deal because slaying the dragon of inflation was regarded for a long time as neoliberalism's greatest achievement. Whatever else you could criticize it for, many people thought that this is what it had convincingly done. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan even claimed that the historical relationships between money and income, between money and the price level, have largely broken down, depriving the aggregates of much of their usefulness as guides to policy. And of course, the conquest of inflation was attributed to deft management by central banks, in particular, the Federal Reserve. And of course, this claim also greatly added to the claim of central banks, particularly the Federal Reserve, to be the sole managers of economies, as they have been, particularly in the United States over the last 30-odd years. Every move they make is typically justified in the name of keeping levels of employment high and growth high and inflation low. But of course, as we know now more clearly than ever before, what they have really been doing, what their eye has really been on, is the creation of huge asset bubbles. I remember reading way back in 2008-9, William Fleckenstein's Greenspan's Bubbles, and many of you may now know that more recently there has been another book by Mark Leonard called Lords of Easy Money, and quite frankly, you don't have to necessarily read these books to know that that's in fact what has been happening. When inflation first made its comeback last year, it was deemed transitory. The Federal Reserve Chairman in particular said, well, this is not going to last. It's just a result of the large amounts of money that we have given to ordinary people, which was, of course, itself an exaggeration. And it soon became clear that inflation was, in fact, not temporary. So today, what we find is that unlike back in the 1970s, at least in my understanding, the Federal Reserve is caught on the horns of a dilemma. It cannot just raise interest rates to the levels necessary to combat inflation. I mean, that itself is not necessarily the best way of dealing with inflation, but I would argue it's the only way capitalist societies have of dealing with inflation. But they can't do this because if they do that, they will bring the financial house of cards on which the wealth of the wealthiest people in the United States and other places rest. So essentially, we are told that they face a dilemma between monetary stability and financial stability. So we're trying to understand this very complex situation today. How did we get here? What exactly happened? Several aspects are important. One is, of course, why now? Why is inflation returning now? And of course, most of you who are interested in the topic will have seen that there have been lots and lots of causes that have to which inflation is attributed, depending on what your favorite is. Astronomical money creation, supply chain destruction, increased demand for inputs, war. Of course, the Russians always have to be blamed for everything that goes wrong in the West, rising commodity prices, climate disruptions to agriculture, etc. The second question is, if inflation has returned today, we also have to look back to what exactly was the reason why it seemed not to make an appearance for the last 40 years. And you can at least name a few obvious reasons: low wages, low prices for third world commodities, and of course, low wages in third world countries, outsourcing, which was associated with it. And finally, of course, the sheer levels of financialization that strangle productive activity, damping the possibilities of inflation. How will this bout of inflation affect the vast majority of the world's people? To what extent will it affect the dollar system? What are the policy options that are progressive? Are monetary measures enough? What does this say about capitalism's ability to sustain productive economies? These are the questions we face, and I'm very happy to say that to discuss with all these questions with us, we have a really distinguished and impressive panel, and I'm particularly pleased that Ingo Schmidt and I, who put together this panel, were able to put together a really good mix of people from North America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So we will go directly to the speakers. I will introduce each speaker when it's their turn to speak. Each speaker will speak for roughly 10 minutes, but then we will have a question and answer session at which they will be able to make more points in direct response to your questions. So when we come to that point, I will request members of the audience who have questions to use the raise hand function. Of course, throughout this, the chat is available for use to everyone. In case you do not wish to be distracted by chats, if you click on the chat icon, it just opens a new window for chat so that the chat does not keep appearing at the bottom of your screen. So you can do that because a lot of people don't like being distracted by chats and other people like chatting. So this is a good way for everybody to do what they like. Okay, so the order of speakers we have is we will first go with CP Chandrasekhar, then Ndongo Samba Sila, then Malika Frangakis, Ingo Schmidt, Michael Hudson, and then we will close with Oscar Ugateche. I will first introduce then CP Chandrasekhar. Chandru is a professor at the Center of Economic Studies and Planning at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He has published widely, of course, in academic journals and has written and co-written many books, including The Market That Failed, Neoliberal Economic Reforms in India, Demonetization Decoded, a critique of India's currency experiments. And he writes regularly. He's prolific. If you read the Ideas website or Frontline or Business Line, etc. I have to say that I always want to check what Chandru is saying if I'm really puzzling over any important development, economic development, whether in India or internationally. So Chandru, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Radhika, for that generous introduction. Yeah, let me start by saying that, the way I'd like to approach the issue of inflation is to treat this as a symptom of the capitalist crisis. That, what we're really, what we're really bothered about or trying to understand is not really inflation per se, even though that is important, but place it in a context in which we understand what is happening to capitalism. Now, whenever we speak of the return to inflation, I think what we need to recognize that is after the golden age, the Great American Celebration, the period between the Second World War and the late 1960s and early 70s, which was a period in which we know, in an exceptional sense, capitalism managed to, or advanced capitalism, managed to ensure this combination of a reasonable rate of growth, relatively low inflation, and of course, a near full employment situation for a significant period of time. It almost appeared that all the problems which in some sense the Great Depression brought forth had been resolved, and inflation was not a problem, growth was not a problem, unemployment was not a problem, because you had these three things together working to say that finally we managed in some sense to deal with the instability or the cyclical tendencies in capitalism, and of course the larger crises which we have in a long-term sense. Now, if we go back and ask ourselves the question, why exactly did it become difficult, impossible for capitalism to sustain that golden age in the period after the 1960s? It's a complex story. But among the elements were the following. First, of course, was the inability to be able to ensure the kind of productivity increases which came as a result of the spin-off effects of R&D during the Second World War, which was commercialized in the period after that, and productivity increases which ensured that productivity was rising faster than wages, which obviously managed to hold down inflation. The second was an ability to be able to ensure that commodity prices, largely because of the fact that the way in which the terms of trade were shifted against developing country primary exporters, including, of course, the exporters of energy before the coming of OPEC, that you were in a position to be able to keep down primary product prices so that intermediate costs, including the cost of energy, could be held down so that the possibility of cost plus inflation was limited. And finally, because of that, even to the extent that there was an increase in wages during this period when unemployment was low in the developed industrial societies, in particular the United States and Germany, etc., you were able to actually ensure that this didn't translate into inflation, not merely because of the fact that you had productivity increases which were significant, but also because of the fact that you were not able, you were able to actually translate, whenever there was a problem, translate the burden of adjusting for inflation onto the shoulders of the exporters of primary commodities. They took the beating in the shift in the international terms of exchange in order to be able to hold inflation at the core. Okay. And it was the inability to be able to ensure this and other circumstances, which in some sense provided the basis, besides Keynesianism, etc., which we speak of, as the floor on the basis of which you could have the golden age, which gave way in the late 1960s and early 70s. Well, the reasons for that we know. First, of course, there was the coming together of the OPEC countries, governments in the OPEC countries, which nationalized the oil resources, formed the cartel, pushed up prices. Long years of boom basically meant commodity prices were tending to rise. And you ended up in the situation, therefore, that one way of making this adjustment, if you continued with a world in which, if you couldn't continue in a world in which productivity advance was faster than money wage increases in the developed countries, which is what it became because of the fact that you couldn't sustain that kind of a post-war scientific and technological revolution, if you wanted to call it that, you ended up with a situation where productivity was not rising as fast as money wages, and you couldn't shift the burden of the adjustment onto primary producers to the same scale. Okay. Now, what did the Great Moderation do? The period in which, post, of course, what Paul Volcker did, the monetary stringency, the cutback in spending, etc., which essentially said that, okay, we're going to in some sense contract demand. We're going to move metropolitan capitalism away from manufacturing per se for the generation of profit into finance. And what did you do? You essentially said that we're going to have a set of things which we're going to exploit. Of course, it wasn't a conspiracy in that sense, but that's the way the capitalist game played out. Is that one, of course, you could ensure that any threat which came from rising money wages at the metropolitan core could be handled by what you had mentioned in your introduction, through a relocation of manufacturing production to all the centers, through the process of globalization which came with the rise to dominance of finance, to centers in which were actually the home to the largest amounts of the reserve army of labor, which is available at relatively low wage costs, which not merely held down wage costs in production, but obviously meant that it had an impact on what happened to wages in the metropolitan core as well, or at least the increase in wages in the metropolitan core. The second was that you broke the back of OPEC. You managed accepting for cyclical shifts at different points of time. You managed once again to be able to bring under control the commodity price boom to the extent that it operated in the latter stages of the Great American Celebration. And you ended up with a situation in which you were operating the system at a level of economic activity outside the realm of finance, which actually meant that demand was rising at a rate relative to the ability to be able to ensure cheap supplies from a globalized environment at levels at which prices didn't tend to rise. So you had this unusual situation, for example, where you could have no inflation in the sense of an increase in the prices of goods and services, but you had huge asset price inflation. So much so that when this was raised, Greenspan basically said, why should we take a shift towards a less easy monetary policy? Because I don't see any inflation. I don't see any bubble. There might be a little bit of froth, but there's no bubble. And on the other hand, you didn't treat asset price inflation as part of inflation. And that's how you sustain this whole process. Now, I think to sort of bring this to an end, I think we have to ask ourselves the question now, therefore, is why couldn't you continue that, particularly in the period after the end, that is pre-COVID, as the growth process was slowing down at a point of time when therefore you're really talking about, in some sense, some kind of a demand contraction, which is occurring even in the metropolitan countries. And of course, you had COVID, which of course affected demand as well. Why were you not in a position post that? Because that is the surprise. I mean, maybe if we're accepting for, a Lawrence and Summers or some, or one or two, everybody said that this inflation is transitory. It essentially is coming because of temporary supply constraints, which are going to get resolved once we get the pandemic to wane, even if not go away. And therefore, really, the surprise was, how come it's not transitory? How come it's still with us? And if we look at it, we have, I think, a multiple set of factors which have undermined the ability of imperialism and metropolitan capitalism to do what it did during the period of the Great Moderation. First, I do think that because of the fact that you created this global supply chains as a part of the process of ensuring the Great Moderation by relocating a whole host of production away from this metropolitan core in order to exploit cheap labor, you've ended up with a situation that if there is any increase in demand in the metropolitan core in response to the crisis, as happened because of the fact that the only countries which use fiscal policy as a significant way of addressing the COVID pandemic or even the pre-pandemic recession, that these were countries in which you were seeing some increase in demand. And that increase in demand, however, was not being matched by supply because of the fact that the uneven distribution of the supply constraint, which the pandemic and other factors had ensured, including the effect it had on transportation, meant that there was an asymmetry in the response of demand and supply as the pandemic waned. That demand was rising, but on the other hand, your expectation that automatically supply would adjust because things are getting better now, we don't have lockdowns, etc., that wasn't happening because of the fact that each time you had one set of lockdowns going, you had another set of lockdowns coming up, either because of another wave or because there were concentrated locations in which the problem arose, as for example in Beijing and Shanghai currently. Okay, the second thing I think with respect to that is really not merely did you have this inability for supply to adjust, but long years of allowing this kind of globalization to proceed essentially meant that any effort to assert metropolitan dominance through using the economic lever or by fighting proxy wars, that actually feeds back. So you can say that I'm going to impose sanctions on China because they are stealing our secrets or technological secrets. But if you begin to do that, you do something to the supply chain. You can say that, okay, we're not happy with what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and we're going to allow these countries to be part of NATO. Fine, that might be a position. But the moment that begins to happen, you realize that, listen, this is uncontrollable. It's even uncontrollable in Europe, which is so dependent on gas imports from Russia. So you actually have a situation where the earlier way in which you tried to manage hegemony in some sense, or that actually now works back. It works back in terms of your ability to be able to ensure not great growth, which you didn't anyway ensure, but to ensure some kind of stability within capitalism of the kind that you have. The third factor, I think, which I think is important, is that the transition to finance, the tendency to allow growth to ride on bubbles, essentially means that now it's not just demand and supply imbalances which determine price, which anyway were not the main thing. But essentially what you have is a tendency for speculative factors to play a major role because of speculative finance entering the scene. If you look at what is happening in food markets now, for example, Lighthouse Reports has done this study, which basically points to the fact that much of the exposures or in futures markets in food commodities is on account of private equity firms, etc. So you're ending up with a situation where the speculative play, which earlier was in equity and bond markets and generated asset price inflation in the developed countries and delivered much riches to the top 1%, now is working to actually ensure a situation where you're not in a position to be able to control inflation because speculative capital steps in the moment you have any sort of imbalance, which actually tends to push up prices. So you put all of this together, and in some sense, what we're saying is that this surprise as to why is this inflation not being transitory is a surprise which disappears once we realize that in some sense, the dominance of the global economy by a set of metropolitan powers has generated a transition or a process of development which actually has feeds back in a way in which the ability it had to ensure the great moderation or the ability it had to ensure the golden age actually is no more. And using monetary policy as a device to try and address that only worsens the problem, which I can, of course, take up in the questions. I'm sorry, I think I've exceeded my time by a couple of minutes.
You're muted, Radha.
I think you're muted.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Chandru. That was really insightful and kind of comprehensive. So I'm going to now introduce the next speaker. That is Ndongo Sambasila. Ndongo is a research and program manager for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and he has written a great deal about money. He's co-author of Africa's Last Colonial Currency and works as head of the Rosa Luxemburg's Program Foundation. He is also the author of The Fair Trade Scandal, Marketing Poverty to Benefit the Rich. And I just add on a personal note that I'm very envious because Ndongo, I believe, studied with and worked closely with Samir Amin. So Ndongo, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Radhika. It's great to be here among all of you. With your authorization, I will share my screen.
Yes, sorry, let me find you and make you co-host. Just 1 second, please. Oh yeah, you're doing it already. Very good. Go ahead.
Okay. I think it works, yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. So I prepared some slides, and I want to challenge a bit the narrative.
Put it in presentation mode. Presentation mode.
Okay. The narrative that the inflation we are witnessing, for example, in Africa, is largely due to the war in Ukraine. There have been a number of recent writings by the World Bank, the IMF, saying that, well, Africans will die of hunger because of what is happening in Ukraine. I think it is a way of finding, let's say, excuses for the for the wrong policies they recommended and impose over African countries. So I basically show some graph in order to try to challenge this labor organization, which shows that there had been what the topic of the conference calls the return of inflation, that between, let's say, the March 2019 to now, there have been a significant increase of inflation worldwide. But the experiences have been very different from one region to another. For example, in the case of Europe and Northern America, you could see clearly that the inflation started to rise continuously from January last year. From, for example, 2% to the current year. And this applies as well for all items and food and non-alcoholic beverages, which you could see in red. In the case, for example, of Latin America and the Caribbean, you have more or less the same pattern, but inflation started to increase before, let's say, by October 2020. And it increased until January, and yeah, still increasing. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, it's a different story, because even before the pandemic, we already had inflation, significant rates of inflation. And you could see in this graph that on January 2019, we have something like 8% of inflation, average inflation for Sub-Saharan Africa. And at the beginning of January 2022, we had something like 24%. And you see the two graphs are really close one another. The graph for all the items and the one for the food and non-alcoholic beverages. So this shows clearly that the war in Ukraine could have been a compounding factor, but it has not created most of the inflation we are now witnessing. This is something due to the way the pandemic has been managed or ill-managed in the global north. But nonetheless, the war in Ukraine had a significant impact on a number of African countries. And this is due to the fact that Russia practically exports everything from food, fertilizer, industrial inputs, agricultural products. This is a graph derived from the Atlas of Economic Complexity, and the data concern the year 2019. You could see that Russia exported something like 40 billion US dollar and had a trade surplus of 64.8 billion. So Russia practically exports everything. You would not clearly see in this graph Russia's exports of wheat, for example. In 2019, it accounted just for 1.4% of all of Russia's exports, and represented in absolute value something like less than 7 billion. But despite these low numbers, we'll see that this is highly significant as a, let's say, major exporter of wheat. And the sources of inflation that the global South is facing following this war, the start of this war, for me, there are five sources. The first is food, because we have seen that there had been an increase in the prices of oil and gas. Russia is a major exporter of fertilizer, and this has an impact on agricultural productivity, obviously. Food also, freight, because the cost of freight have increased, and also access to finance, because in the meantime, we have seen also that the costs of foreign finance have increased for most African countries. So all these four Fs, the five Fs, they combine to create significant inflation, in addition to what African countries were living, let's say, before the start of this war. You could see is graphs from the IMF that with the start of this war, there had been an increase of major commodities, oil, natural gas, the metals, and also wheat. You could see that clearly. For food products, the rising prices started before the war, but it has continued with the war. Here you have graphs from the UNCTAD, and which shows the global role played by both Russia and Ukraine. They represent a significant amount of the global exports of corn, of colza seeds, barley, wheat, and also sunflower and seeds. Of what is more African perspective is the high dependence from many African countries from the wheat exported on exports from these two countries, starting with Eritrea, who imports 33% of its wheat from Russia, to Somalia, which just imports everything from these two countries. And this kind of evidence has
Ndongo, can you hear us?
Yeah, his audio was very unstable. He might have dropped out.
Just going to give him a minute to see, a few seconds to see if he can come back. But otherwise, what we might do is I will email him. We will go to the next speaker, and then we'll see if he can rejoin us.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry for.
Oh, great. Then continue, please.
I don't know where I stopped, but yeah.
I think you were at the graph with the sideways graph with the, yeah, that one. Yeah.
This one, okay.
No, previous one, the one you showed earlier. No, down.
Okay.
Yeah, that one, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, in this graph, you could see that there are at least 25 African countries which are highly dependent on exports from Russia and Ukraine, exports of wheat, starting from Eritrea, 33%, to Somalia, 100%. This kind of evidence has given rise to many comments from the IMF, World Bank, and other people saying that there is a looming food crisis in this war, etc. But the thing is, in that narrative, they never say why African countries do not have, let's say, their food sovereignty, because in most African countries, the labor force is majoritarily working in the agricultural sector. So what explains that African countries themselves are not, let's say, able to feed their own populations? And I think this has to do with the free trade policies, which the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization have been, let's say, recommending African countries to follow. And you could see that clearly with this draft. And their discourse is always to say that, well, they do not need food sovereignty, but at least something they call food security, in the sense that they could rely on markets to feed themselves. That means that they have only to export, for example, oil or other basic commodities, so as to find the foreign exchange and just to buy the food they need, but they do not need necessarily to be net food exporters, for example. So in this narrative, they never take into account responsibility of IMF, World Bank, and the WTO in this kind. Say, in fact, that there have been in some countries food riots, food crisis, because in fact the IMF had been urging governments to follow what they call fiscal consolidation and the removal of subsidies on the, let's say, the basic grants, let's say, consumed by the people, or at least people from urban settings. Currently in Africa, you have 36 countries ranked by the AO, and among them there are only two which are, let's say, oil. One, Sudan even is not an oil exporter, because oil, let's say, exported by South Sudan. And Sudan is a very interesting case, because
Ndongo, if I may just briefly interrupt, if you have no more pictures to show, maybe if you turn off your video, we can hear your presentation better, because you're breaking up and because your bandwidth is low, this may be a better solution. Okay. What do you think? Yeah.
Okay. I had finished, I think. I was just giving the case of Sudan, because in fact, they follow IMF advice to remove subsidies for food, and strong protest, which led to the overthrow of Omar al-Bashir. After that, Sudan normalized its relationships with the West, and US sanctions against Sudan were removed. But the thing is that they still continue to, let's say, to say to government to remove food and food subsidies. The same, let's say, organizations that are saying that what is happening in Africa is due to the war in Ukraine. In fact, before that, they were advising government to remove food and food subsidies. So it is clear that the war in Ukraine has compounded Sudan's problems, but the neoliberal policies imposed on those countries have been the native. So in conclusion, I would just say quickly that the so-called return of inflation, because in many African countries, inflation was production based on low-cost labor is in crisis. When the globalized labor force ceases to work, inflation trade has failed the countries that accepted to become net food importers, like some of the African countries. The idea also that central banks with more independence can tackle inflation also has shown its limitations with this current crisis. And monetary policy, as Chandra said, is a very blunt tool to address the current issues. Another observation is that Western economic and financial sanctions are generally counterproductive and self-defeating when they are targeted against major exporters of global critical goods, like, for example, Russia or maybe China one day. African countries are caught in a difficult situation to stabilize their economies, their exchange rate, and their foreign currency. But sooner or later, the foreign debt will have to be repaid, which requires fiscal consolidation in the language of the IMF. So the issue for them is how long they will be able to postpone deflationary adjustment. Thank you for your attention. These were my initial inputs.
Okay, thank you so much, Ndongo. If you could stop the share, that would also be good. Thank you. Great. So I think your talk, I hope everybody got it, but I thought you really highlighted very important things, particularly about the vulnerability created by imperialism of African countries. And I think this is a very critically important aspect of the present situation. And hopefully policymakers in these countries are taking notes and seeking to reduce this vulnerability. But let's go forward now to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Malika Frangakis. Malika is an independent researcher and member of the board of the Nikos Poulantzas Institute in Athens. And she is also a member of the steering committee of the Euro Memo Group, the European Economists for an Alternative Economic Policy in Europe. So Malika, please, the floor is yours.
Right, yeah. I'm here. I unmuted and I'm with you. Hello, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion on a very topical issue and a very topical matter. From a European perspective, inflation is indeed back after a long absence. An inflation narrative is needed in order not only to understand current developments, but also to provide a framework within which the left may best formulate its strategy. I shall address, having been invited to this interesting discussion, I shall address the issue of inflation, causes, consequences, political implications, mainly with reference to the EU and to the Eurozone. Roughly, what I shall do is to look into the inflation figures in the EU and the factors behind them, the role of expectations in shaping the dominant inflation narrative. I shall then examine the main elements of the EU labour market and the likelihood of a wage price spiral taking over, aka 1970s, the response of the central banks, and not just in Europe, and just a few thoughts about an alternative response from a left point of view. Okay, starting with the inflation rate in the EU. I'm sorry I haven't got any beautiful graphs, but roughly in March this year, the annual rate reached 7.8% in the European Union and 7.5% in the Eurozone. Interestingly, there is a very great variation across the member states, ranging from 4.6, which is just over half in Malta, to 15.6, which is almost double in Lithuania. And also, one should note that the big economies of the European Union present the same kind of a similar variation. So you have Germany 8%, Spain 10%, above average both, France 5%, Italy 7%, below average. What about the factors that make for inflation? The annual rate in the Eurozone, the annual rate I already mentioned, has reached 7.5%, and it was at this level both in March and in April. Now, if we exclude energy, this drops to 4.2, I'm sorry. And if we exclude energy and unprocessed food from the index, this falls to 3.9, which is almost half. In other words, inflation is to a considerable extent due to the increase in energy prices, both directly and indirectly, as well as to the increase in the price of food commodities. A significant jump is observed in the annual rate of inflation, is observed in the European Union. At the same time, there are tentative signs of a slowdown as of last April. At this point in time, we need a longer-term series in order to confirm the duration, whether this inflation is going to persist. What is important, though, to note is that A, as I've just said, it shows great variation across the 27 member states. It is not yet on a steady path, and it is largely accounted for by the increase in energy prices and food commodities. Now, is inflation demand-driven or cost-driven? That's an important question. The European economy and indeed the global economy have suffered a double blow in recent years. Previous speakers already mentioned the pandemic, which is unfortunately still unfolding, and of course the war in Ukraine, which is equally unfortunately still carrying on. To this cocktail, one should add the zero COVID stance of the Chinese government, which further intensifies the problems created by the other two factors. So basically what we have had is lockdowns and restrictive measures during the pandemic, which led to the closing down of many businesses, especially medium and small size, supply chain disruptions, disturbances of global trade patterns, the return to various forms of protectionism. Now, the reopening of the economy revealed many of these problems as well as intensified them. As the economy recovered, the price of energy, which had collapsed following the onset of the pandemic, for example, in May 2020, the ECB harmonized index for consumer prices for energy declined by 12%. Now, energy prices returned to a steep upward path as of mid-2021, accounting for about half, as we just said, half of the rate of inflation in the EU. The war in Ukraine led to a further soaring in energy prices, adding uncertainty about the future. And I take Chudru's point about speculative finance here, which is making matters a lot more difficult. Equally, the sanctions applied, I agree with previous speakers, the sanctions applied in order to deter and punish Russia have a damaging effect for those applying them, as Russia and Ukraine produce large amounts of global supply of gas, oil, wheat, fertilizers, etc. Overall, price pressures reflect both supply and demand factors. However, the inflation narrative carries important policy implications. Should policy, in other words, seek to dampen demand or reduce costs? Where should the emphasis lie? And I should point out at this point here that what's happening with demand in Europe is not what's happening with demand in the US. In Europe, there have been no transfers of amounts of money to the directly to the population. There have been other measures to contain the effect of the pandemic. So our analysis, to my mind, so far, points to a cost push type of inflation, whereby energy and commodities are exerting upward pressure on costs and thereby on prices. By contrast, nominal wages are increasing at a lower rate than inflation, thus declining in real terms. At the same time, what we are witnessing is a gathering storm of stagflation. The combination of the pandemic and the war is opening the way to stagflation as prices are rising due largely to supply factors while growth is slowing down. I shan't go into the figures because I don't think I have the time. However, the IMF is already bringing down its general projections for growth and raising its general projections for inflation. So stagflation seems to be in the horizon. At this point, it's interesting to note the so-called unmooring of expectations. In other words, by historical standards, the current rate of inflation may be considered as moderate. For those of us who were around in the 1970s, well, this is not really impressive. This is interesting and it's worth discussing, but it's not, the end of the world. So what is all the fuss about, one might ask? Well, it is the fear that expectations will become unmoored, in quotes, or de-anchored, leading to a wage price spiral. Therefore, the emphasis shifts on worker demands for wages that compensate for the rise in prices. Indeed, the BIS general manager has warned that rising pressure on prices is likely to keep inflation at its highest level for more than 3 decades in many countries. Given the crucial role of the so-called expectations, how are they defined or measured? Well, mainly by service of experts. For example, the ECB runs a quarterly survey of the opinions and expectations of experts affiliated with financial and non-financial institutions based within the EU on inflation, growth, and unemployment. Such surveys are also conducted by news organizations such as Reuters. So we have people who are linked to mainly to the financial world, making the formulating ideas about expectations. And basically what that does is to lay the basis for the formulation of perceptions, to the extent that these expectations are all over the financial press, financial sites, and so on and so forth. So there's a climate, if you like, being cultivated here. Interestingly, a very recent BIS bulletin is headed, "Are major advanced economies on the verge of a wage price spiral?" They're not very much convinced. And actually they do say, evidence for a broad acceleration in wage growth is mixed. Wage growth has picked up significantly in the US, but remains moderate in most other advanced economies, despite tentative signs of a renewed sensitivity of wages to inflation in some segments of the labor market and a pickup in inflation expectations. If inflation remains high, households may ask for higher wages to make up for lost purchasing power, and firms may raise prices to protect profit margins. And stubbornly high inflation may lead to institutional changes, such as automatic indexation and cost of living adjustment clauses. We can see here this probabilistic kind of approach already laying the ground for expectations being unmoored, for perceptions being formulated. So the BIS report recommends that policymakers should be attuned to shifts in inflation expectations and to potential pressure to reinstate institutional structures that made economies more prone to wage price spirals in the past. That is the scare, basically, the way I read it. Now, to put these conclusions and recommendations into perspective, a quick look at the labor market in the EU. The wage share over the 20-year period, 2001 to 2021, increased by less than 1%, 0.7%. It is in 2021, it was equal to 37.8%, and in the following year, it came down. Now, employers' contributions during that time, during the 20-year period, declined by 0.4%. So basically, we have had, the share of labor in production increased by a very small amount. And at the same time, it has had to take responsibility for many of the benefits that employers used to contribute to in the past. This does not indicate, what we have here is a fairly static picture of the way wages are going, which was already pointed out by previous speakers. Now, the fears that a wage price spiral may be imminent tend to ignore the practically static wages in the EU, preferring to stress the fall in unemployment and the rise in job vacancies. Indeed, unemployment has declined from 7.5% of the EU labor force to 6.2% in March 2022, from nearly 16 million to 13 million. Now, I don't wish to underestimate the drop in the number of unemployed persons. However, what we have in Europe right now in the European Union is an army of unemployed that is bigger than the population of a small EU country such as Greece. And that, to my mind, does not indicate a tight labor market. It is a serious cause for concern. Other causes for concern include the very high rate of unemployment amongst the young people, which is double the rate of the average rate for the whole labor force. And of course, the divergences amongst the EU member states, which go up to 13%. The average goes up to 13% in Greece and in Spain, while the average, the rate for the young, the unemployed under 25s, goes up to 27 and 30%. So looking at unemployment rates on just the basis of one average rate is just, not enough. It's not it doesn't convey the picture of what's happening on the ground. EU job vacancy rates increased, indeed, from 1.8% in 2020, at the end of 2020, to 2.8% the same quarter 2021. Again, however, differences across the EU member states are very wide, ranging from 4 in Belgium and Czechia, which is the high end, to 1 or under, or to less than 1 in Bulgaria, Greece, and Spain. In view of the above state of the labor market, I would argue that the bargaining power of the unions is anything but evident, and therefore the fear that such bargaining power will increase wages. In fact, the union's bargaining power has declined alongside their falling and graying membership, as membership has not kept pace with the rise in numbers employed, while the average age of union members is greater than the average age of wage and salary earners. As it might be expected, the proportion of employees covered by collective bargaining varies greatly. It is the highest in the Nordic countries and the lowest in the Central and Eastern European countries. Where the union membership is low, company-level bargaining is dominant. Overall, it would appear that fears of an imminent wage price spiral are exaggerated. Not only is the labor market not tight across the EU, but also the unions tend to prioritize job security over higher wages, as shown by the low nominal wage increase in 2021. Now,
please
central banks to the task. Am I over the?
Yes, close. Please wrap up as soon as
I'll try. Yeah, thanks. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Now, the central banks have rallied to the task, raising interest rates. The ECB has fallen behind and is being reprimanded for doing so, because they believe that by raising interest rates, they will hold back demand. It is and therefore discourage any wage price spiral from taking effect. Now, as we've already seen, a stagflation is somewhere in the horizon. Therefore, somebody called it monetary policy is a blunt tool. Indeed, monetary policy is a blunt tool. It risks making everything worse right now. So, one more point. What do I do? What should we do about inflation? What could be an alternative answer? Well, I don't have the actual alternative answer as such. However, I would like to give one idea, and this is price controls. It may be controversial right now. It's not new. It was very much discussed in the post-World War II period. And it has been suggested by Isabella Weber from Amherst University. And it was a strong proponent was John Kenneth Galbraith, back in the 70s, actually. John Kenneth Galbraith has a very nice quote, which I would like to end with, which says that all price and wage controls involve an arbitrary exercise of public power. But this is not an objection, for it replaces an arbitrary exercise of private power, and one that has further and exceedingly arbitrary effects for those that suffer from the resulting inflation. Thank you very much. Sorry if I went over the time allotted.
No worries. Thank you, Malika. Very interesting. And I think James Galbraith is here, so he might want to say something about your quote as well, and about John Kenneth Galbraith. Okay, our next speaker is Ingo Schmidt. And Ingo is academic coordinator of the Labor Studies program at Athabasca University in Canada. His research focuses mainly on international political economy and labor movements. He's written two of his recent books published by Pluto are Reading Capital Today in 2017 and 3 Worlds of Social Democracy in 2015. And he also wrote Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital, which was published by VSA Verlag in 2013. So Ingo, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Radhika. Hello, everybody. I will actually focus quite a bit on energy prices, ecology, and geopolitics. And to do that, I will start with giving some stylized facts. And I understand after Marika's talk, that is quite a challenging thing to do, given the variety of inflation and other economic developments across countries. I should say that my stylized facts refer to the first world, to Western countries, even though energy prices are obviously world market prices. Then I will focus on the interpretation of what I consider a key part of the return of inflation, which is energy prices, geopolitics, and the challenge and problems of moving away from fossil capitalism. And I will end with a very brief and very bleak outlook, but I do hope by doing so I will get some more optimistic, positive pushback in the discussion in terms of what we can do moving forward, dealing with some of the problems that we are facing. And like Chandru said, I can only reiterate that inflation is a symptom of something much larger and actually much more problematic than inflation could ever be. So my stylized facts, is there a demand pull inflation in the Western countries? No, I don't think so. There was talk about it after the first wave of the pandemic, after the first lockdown was over. But since then, the boom has been delayed and delayed and delayed. And even without rising interest rates, most economic forecasters are warning that we are probably in for a recession rather than for a demand boom. And therefore, there's also no demand pull inflation. The next popular thing that's always coming up, and Malika talked about it quite a bit already, is wages. If you just look at wages, yes, nominal wages are rising in most countries, but only a little bit after the Great Recession, not by very much. And if you look at wages and prices to calculate real wages and wage shares and profit shares, you very quickly get the picture that what we're having right now is a profit inflation. Profit margins are increasing drastically. There's enormous crisis profiteering going on at this point. I will come back to that in a moment, just to kind of cancel out the last most among the popular explanations of why there might be inflation. It's of course money supply. Some people may remember the monetarists, Milton Friedman. That is not a good explanation at all, because since 2008, since the Great Recession, there was basically free money, at least for people who didn't have difficulty having money in the first place. There were unlimited supplies of money, and there was not much inflation since then. But there was a return very briefly after the Great Recession of the commodity boom that actually started very early in the 2000s. If there was general inflation after the Great Recession, it was almost entirely triggered by the resurgence of the commodity boom. And what is notable currently after the Corona and the war in Ukraine events started to unfold is that there's a much stronger spillover from energy prices to general inflation. And this, I think, has to do largely by crisis profiteering, jumping to chances to jack up profit margins in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. But as I said, I will mainly focus on commodity prices. Energy prices, most particular. Obviously, energy prices are related to food prices. And I should also say there is almost uninterrupted, despite the housing crisis in the United States in 2007, if you look like at 20, 30-year-long developments, it has always almost become invisible. House price, and if house prices were properly reflected in inflation data, inflation would have been much higher for a very long time. What is noticeable is that the main drivers of inflation, houses, food, and energy, are all related to ground rent. And there's also a connection to finance, into which I will not go. I assume Michael Hudson will speak about that. But it's all finance is clearly kind of driving the inflation in everything having to do with ground rent and industrial capital, which should be the big profiteer of cheap supplies of labor thanks to global neoliberal globalization, has to share some of its profits with finance and the owners of land, because we have these developments of commodity prices. Now, I already mentioned the commodity boom, some called it a super cycle, started in the early 2000s. What also started in the early 2000s, I mentioned geopolitics, was the war on terror. It seems to me quite clear there's a link between the war on terror and the commodity super cycle, which, just to reiterate, the Great Recession of 2008 only interrupted it, but it came back with a vengeance very shortly thereafter. And the commodity cycle ended in 2014. Now, what's the story behind that? The United States, ever since OPEC, were very nervous about losing control of becoming dependent on energy imports from other countries and losing control over global energy supplies, because next to finance, food and military power, it's a convenient tool to display imperial power over the world. The problem of the United States, of course, is its own supplies of energy are largely what usually called non-conventional forms, like the shale gas boom. They are only profitable if energy prices are sufficiently high. In other words, the United States needed high oil prices, regardless of all the talk that prices should be low. Generally, energy prices were exempt, just like housing. They needed to be high in order to bring the US back into the big player game of energy exports, and they did. Just there's a problem with that. High energy prices also benefit those countries who sit on supplies that are easier to access, i.e. where production costs are much lower, therefore profits are higher. And as it turns out, those are mostly countries that are considered as unfriendly enemy countries or whatever. Some of them have been bombed, Iraq and Libya. Others have been sanctioned, like Venezuela, Iran, and most recently Russia. So the geopolitical problem here is quite obviously that the United States relies on high energy prices that benefit the very countries that it considers as enemies. And the way of dealing with this through sanctions and war leads to a further strain on the, let's say, on the American empire, which under that pressure is falling apart more and more. It's more difficult to sustain because the very means applied to sustain an American empire are the very same reasons as war and sanctions that are making sure that it is falling apart. This, by the way, is not only true, it's not my topic today, but clearly something to keep in mind. It's not only true with as far as sanctions in the energy sector go. I just like to remind people of the trade war with China, and there are other cases that are important, or the weaponization of the US dollar, of course, the seizing of central bank or foreign reserves by the West. Whatever other governments might think of Vladimir Putin, it's clearly a signal that the holy grail of neoliberal economics, that private property is untouchable. It doesn't apply to the preachers of neoliberalism. If that's not a major strain on global neoliberalism spearheaded by the United States, I don't know what could be. And I also said I would talk about ecology. The major victim of this current wave of energy-related inflation and geopolitical conflict, the major victim is nature, which of course is if there's an overarching problem in the world, it's ecological devastation. The whole war and sanction regime does nothing to contribute, despite all the green talk and everybody's buying Teslas now, thereby insinuating that nothing has to change other than you get an electric car instead of having a fossil fuel powered car. The whole discussion about having ecologically sustainable ways of production and life kind of has been destroyed by the current war and sanction regime. And this leads me to my, I promised to get a bleak outlook, and here it is. Obviously, the first part of the bleak outlook and probably the most devastating is the ecological outlook. And let's be clear, war is kind of an accelerated way of ecological and social destruction. But on top of that, interestingly enough, Radhika mentioned that in her introduction, that it's basically impossible to raise interest rates because it destroys the financial center, which was key for moving capitalism and imperialism forward for over 30, 40 years. But it seems more and more there is, despite being dependent on cheap money and asset inflation, more and more there seems to be in capitalist elite circles a consensus that we will do it anyways. And it will be a special, I'm wrapping up. It will be actually austerity Ronald Reagan kind. Like during the days of Ronald Reagan, they're gearing up for austerity for those who want some butter. There will be no enormous cuts to the butter. But at the same time, they are not only fighting inflation through interest rate hikes, they're also preparing to pump more and more money into the arms industry. We're already seeing that most governments seem to be so grateful that there is a war in Ukraine. It's a perfect excuse to produce more and more weapons. But I don't see how the rest of the Reagan story, which kicked off neoliberal globalization, could be replayed, because neoliberal globalization is coming apart at its seams, as I said, due to sanctions and war. And I really wish people can come up with some positive pushback to my bleak outlook. So that was my little spiel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ingo, and I particularly appreciated your focus on, on the military aspects and the sanctions aspects. So thanks very much for those observations. Our final two speakers now. First, Michael Hudson. Michael is a financial analyst and president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends. He's also a distinguished research professor of economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and also professor at the School of Marxist Studies at Peking University in China. Michael has served as economic advisor to many governments, including the United States, Canadian, Mexican, and Latvian, consultant to UNITA, the Institute for Research on Public Policy, and the Canadian Science Council, among many other organizations. Michael is the author of over 10 books on issues related particularly to money, finance, rent, etc. So, Michael, please go ahead.
Well, since the earlier speakers have already been very clear on explaining what inflation is and where it's going, since I'm an economist, I'm going to talk about what economists talk about, which is what isn't inflation, and what's the excuse, and what economists like to blame it on labor at rising wages, on government social spending, and of course on Russia trying to break away from America's unipolar international order. So, sorry, inflation is basically the excuse that right-wing governments have for trying to lower wage levels by blaming the inflation on rising wages. Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to 20% in 1980 to cause a recession, because he said it is worth causing a recession that will lead to less hiring and stop labor's wage gains in the 1970s. He was my former boss at Chase Manhattan in the 1960s, and he was always
said that the big concern of finance is wage gains will mean that the purchasing power of all of our investors who have bank accounts and stocks and bonds will have less power over wages. And our class interest is in increasing our power over wages. So we've got to keep wages down, even if it causes a recession. That's basically the Federal Reserve's policy. That's what monetary theory is all about. About a month ago, the present Federal Reserve Chairman, Jay Powell, came right out and announced that the Biden administration's Democratic Party policy is, quote, to get wages down and to get inflation without having to slow the economy and have a recession and have unemployment rise materially. In other words, you want to keep the finance, insurance, and stock market, real estate sector going. You just want to squeeze down wages somehow. So the objective of all this is that if labor wants to get a job and the health insurance that goes with it, then labor will have to lower its wage levels. That's the current US government policy. Well, it's junk economics, of course. Today's inflation throughout the world, not only in the United States, but in Europe, is led by pure monopoly power, headed, as the previous speakers have said, by energy and food prices. The United States and NATO, they're trying to blame inflation on Putin and Russia not exporting oil and gas to Europe as a result of the NATO sanctions against it. But gas hasn't stopped yet. And until a few days ago, on Thursday, the US oil companies have said that looking forward, they see a supply problem. And they're raising prices now, even though the supply of oil hasn't really changed at all. So you have supply being fairly constant, prices going way up because the oil companies say, we anticipate they'll go up, therefore we're raising wages, raising oil prices because we can. Well, the same thing is happening in agriculture. Farmers are getting much less for their crops, but the great intermediary monopolies like Cargill are taking and raking off much more commission income and buying crops cheap. So the farmers are getting lower prices for their dairy products, their milk, and their crops, but prices for milk and crops are going up in the store. Same thing, you're also having rent rising as a result of the plunge in home ownership rates that started with President Obama's mass evictions of the victims of junk mortgage lending in the under his administration, and the private capital investors that are taking over all of the houses, the owner-occupied houses that have defaulted. They're being sold off, and you've had home ownership rates falling by about 10% in the United States since 2008. Well, now you have companies like Blackstone very sharply rising rents. In New York, they've been jumping by about 1/3 in the last year. So again, with the same amount of real estate, prices are going way up. So none of this can be blamed on labor. None of this can be blamed on money creation. And that's the other thing the government's blaming on. You have the Republicans always saying, well, the real cause of inflation, as Milton Friedman said, is too much money chasing goods, and all the money, they say, comes from running budget deficits. So they say America has to stop running a budget deficit. Of course, we have to give more money to NATO, more money to the military-industrial complex to produce arms for Ukraine. That means we have to cut back social spending very substantially. And in fact, the Biden administration has been cutting back spending against the pandemic. So that's the situation here. The earlier speakers have talked about the global South countries, especially Africa. And they have an added problem that is going to cause inflation there over and above what's been talked about today. And that is the drain of their debt service on their dollarized foreign debt. Now, the US dollar is soaring, especially because interest rates have been rising in the United States. Well, when it soars, it's largely because the Federal Reserve policy This has already led the euro to plunge, and it's going down towards €1 per dollar rate. And the Japanese yen has also plunged by holding its interest rates low. There's a large outflow of the carry trade to borrow cheap in Japan and buy US dollars and other foreign investments. So the exchange rates of many third world countries are also beginning to decline because of energy, because of food, and also they have their foreign debt service coming due, and the dollars are much more expensive. So this forces them to make a choice. And that choice is the intended policy of US economic strategists. Either they're going to have to cut back on their food and their energy imports, or and pay their foreign bondholders, or they'll have to pay the foreign bondholders. That's the choice. Who's going to get paid, the bondholders or their own people who need food and energy? The question is, what are the client oligarchies going to do? Well, they're going to serve the bondholders more than their own populations as usual. And Janet Yellen, the former Federal Reserve Chairman and now Secretary of the Treasury, said that the upcoming IMF meetings have to create a new backing for the unipolar world economy run by the United States. And she said the way to do this is by creating new special drawing rights, SDRs, paper gold, most of which is going to be given to the United States. And it'll also be given to global South countries to enable them not to default. They'll just borrow more from the IMF. But to do that, they have to submit to IMF austerity. They have to believe what the IMF says inflation is caused by. The IMF traditionally has said, you can afford higher oil prices, you can afford higher food prices, just cut your labor and living standards. That's equilibrium. Equilibrium is the bondholders get the money, you don't. Equilibrium is labor standards go down and down and down. That's equilibrium defined as how can America continue to live in the lifestyle it's living in without actually producing more, while it's actually industrializing. How can it live by financial means and by imperial means without being an industrial economy, without being more productive? So the SDRs are going to be conditional on countries selling off yet more of their domestic resources, selling off yet more of their raw materials, oil, their land, their real estate. The IMF said, all you have to do is sell off your assets and the capital account will balance the current account, the trade account. So obviously this is an opportunity for the United States to lock in its control over debtor countries, over Europe. Now that Europe is having to pay much higher prices for its oil and gas, it's becoming much less competitive with other countries. That's why the euro is falling. Japan is continuing to decline. So the United States expects to be the beneficiary of this inflation because its oil companies control the world oil trade. And if oil is going way up in price and gas is going way up in price, this is going to be an enormous benefit to the US balance of payments, and oil company stocks are already soaring in price. The military industrial stocks are all soaring in price because Europe and other countries are told to pay much more for their arms to fight against the victims of the NATO war against Russia actually fighting back. So the war in Ukraine has become a windfall for the United States. And the US is using this, the inflation, to push its junk economic theory, saying that, again, as I mentioned, the cure of inflation is to cut back on government budget deficits. So right now, in the middle of the COVID epidemic, and in the middle of food and energy squeezes, countries are told to stop subsidizing their fuel, stop subsidizing their food. This means that even as labor's wages go down in the global South, they're going to have less of their shrinking wage income to be spent on goods and services, because it'll be spent more and more on imported oil and gas. That's the squeeze that they're in. Well,
if you wrap up, Michael, yeah. What? If you wrap up soon.
Yeah, that's basically it. What is inflated today is being asset prices, not commodity prices, except where monopolies are controlling a rising share of the market. So we're having really the monopolies and the rentiers fighting back under the guise of fighting inflation.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. That was really informative and I think, very important set of observations about how the United States will benefit or expects to benefit from this. Whether it will, of course, is another matter. Okay. Our final speaker is Oscar Ugarteche. Oscar is an economist, writer, and professor, and senior researcher at the Institute of Economic Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, or UNAM. And his work specializes in economics, international finance, economic history, and the world economy. I'm always very impressed by the detail with which, facts and figures with which Oscar supports his arguments. So Oscar, please, the floor is yours. Oscar, yeah, there you are.
Thanks for the invitation. And the work I'm going to present is a work that I do with the observatory, with Latin American Economic Observatory we have at the Institute, and we publish weekly notes on the thing, highly detailed weekly notes on the thing. The first thing is, I think, it has been mentioned, but I want to mention it again, the problem of asynchronicity between producers.
Presentation mode, Oscar, please, presentation mode.
Sorry. There we are. We have a problem of asynchronicity with factories closing down in China and opening up and closing down and opening up. That caused a bottleneck problem. And that caused a transport problem, a container problem. And it ended up hitting end goods, durable, consumer durables. So there you have an impact on prices that cannot be helped. I mean, that's the result of asynchronicity. You'll have to really knock down demand worldwide for those prices to go down. It's not a problem of one country, it's general. That's one thing. The second thing is China's surplus has grown in spite of everything. It's grown, which on the other side means that the US deficit has increased enormously. And of course, as we all know, an external deficit is financed externally. The US external deficit is financed by central banks, mainly. And it's financed with the instrument of US Treasury bonds. So the US deficit is financed by international, worldwide central banks, which have record levels of international reserves. So when everybody is so terribly worried about the debt problems, I wonder, maybe there are debt problems in places that I have not seen. But generally speaking, in the global south, we have an excess international reserves. And that excess international reserves is a result of excess adjustment over the past however many years. We have almost not grown over the past, 10, 15 years to keep inflation down, it was argued. But what it really did was accumulate international reserves to finance the US external deficit. And now what we are having, and that's very funny, what we're having is imported inflation. Now here you have the freight prices and the way they have gone up. And with a partial opening of the US in May of 2020, the total opening in August of 2020, and the opening of Europe in December of 2020, and all of that pushed freight prices up. And it pushed freight prices up because basically the bottlenecks on the ports were 11 days long. So the cost of freight just went up, just shot up. And that's still being felt. Here you have, this is what a bottleneck looks like. That's Panama. And this was only 3 months ago. If you look at it today, it doesn't look like this anymore. Now, we have food inflation, but nobody speaks about the drought, which is surprising. And there you have the drought. Everything that is marked in brown and yellow is the drought. The drought started in 2019. It's the worst drought in world history. It covers a good part of Asia. It covers North America and South America and a good part of Africa and Europe. So what we're having now is a reduction in supply, of food supply. And you can see it very clearly when well, here you have the drought in South America. The beginning of the drought was in January 2019, and you can see how this goes up, but then prices go further up when the Fed injects liquidity into the markets in 23rd March 2020, and it injected $3 trillion into the market. And that hit commodity prices directly, food prices directly. So you have a combination of that drought plus speculation. Additional elements now, it's everything that has been spoken about the importance of Russia for the provision of certain goods. Just thinking of sunflower seeds and others. But there's one thing that is being hit and has not been mentioned, and that's microchips. Microchips had already been hit before because of this problem of synchronicity. The new reason is that neon gas that is used for the production of microchips is 70% of world neon gas is produced by one firm called Creolin in Odessa. And that firm is shut. So we're going to have a scarcity, or we're already having a scarcity of microchips, which pushes microchip prices up. So you have food prices up, microchip prices up, and then on top of that, you have fuel prices up. Now, those countries that have fuel, that have oil, Mexico has oil, can afford to have subsidized prices and keep prices stable, which they have. Nevertheless, we here in Mexico, we have one of the highest inflation rates in Latin America, in spite of having the fuel prices stable. So what's hitting inflation in Mexico is not fuel, it's food, and food directly related to the drought, because this has been happening for the past 3 years, since 2019, before COVID. And it's just gotten worse. It's just gotten much worse. And of course, then we have all of the monetary explanation. We don't need to go into that. So that's generally speaking, we have a complex of elements that cannot be faced. Here you have what I was talking to Brian a second ago. Here you have interest rates in the US from 1990 on, the downward trend and the upward trend of commodity prices that have just petered out as interest rates start to go up, and they have started to fall down. But this is generally the trend of commodity prices and of interest rates. So we have I don't know if the correlation is very strong or not, but the trend, the inverse trend is clear. And I think the quote is very clever. It's cheap money is like alcohol to an alcoholic for a speculator. So what we're having now is this collapse, the collapse of commodity prices, which is, I find it very amusing. You have, this is copper that is falling, and this is iron ore on the right. The iron ore is a 1 year data. Copper is only 1 month, just the last month. But here you have the counterfactual, no? So commodities in general are going up. Some commodities are now going down because of interest rates. And in spite of those interest rates, you have food prices still going up. And that's to do with the supply. And the drought. Let's keep the drought in mind. Nobody speaks of the drought. And this is the worst drought in history. So when we have these funny weathers in the north of Canada, or here in Mexico, that's the result of climate change. And climate change is hurting water. There's water scarcity, and that's hurting the production of food. So all of that combined, I think, leads us to inflation, and that's not monetary. So we're going to have this funny situation we had in the 1970s of the South growing like crazy because commodity prices are up, in spite that they're now tapering down, but they're still up. We're going to have developed countries, rich countries, not growing. And we're going to have inflation everywhere. And monetary inflation might be controlled, but monetary inflation is only a part of inflation. The rest of inflation, until we get back into the just-on-time logic of globalization, which is still there, hasn't gone away, until we go back to that logic and production becomes synchronized again, we're going to have scarcities. And with a microchip scarcities, now made even worse with the problem of the neon gas in Odessa, I fear we're going to have a industrial product inflation up in spite of high interest rates. So I don't think we're going to see inflation go down, and I think we're going to see more income concentration, no doubt, yes. That's a clear result. And the way to resolve this is to produce more. That's the only way out. And to have more food security, and to trade more with your closer neighbors, and to strengthen relationship with your neighbors for lines of production that cannot be completed within your own territory, but not sort of extending this trade far away, and perhaps having some types of price controls, no doubt. And somebody spoke about the marketing boards. I remember the marketing boards in the 1970s, and when they were knocked down. But I also remember price controls when we had hyperinflation in Peru, and how they didn't work. How once inflation got beyond whatever it was, 50% a year, price controls didn't work. But maybe price controls work with under 10% inflation. One thing that I am observing, which is interesting, is that in spite of Mexico has inflation and has not changed the fuel price. Fuel is not a component of a domestic component. Imported prices are, but not domestic. Bolivia has no inflation, has a very low inflation, 3% inflation, Bolivia. They keep the rate of exchange stable, and they keep fuel prices stable and food prices stable. And they have done this by producing more. And it's worked so far. Some argue they're going to run out of international reserves. Let's watch. But for the time being, inflation is under control. So more production is a way out, know that. Thank you.
Radhika, you need to unmute.
Thank you, Malika. And thank you, Oscar. That was a very important note to end on. Indeed, some of us have been chatting about that in the chat. And as Chandru said right at the start, this has also something to do with how we think about capitalism, because how do you increase supply? If state investment is what's necessary, then it clearly goes against the grain of capitalism. So I'm looking forward to a really great question and answer session. Those of you who have questions, please use the raise hand function in order to let me know that you have questions. And meanwhile, I'm just going to ask, while you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to ask Alan Freeman to make a short announcement. Alan, please go ahead. 1 minute, please.
Well, I've been called Friedman before. I have not yet been called Greenspan, but thank you. And I am the finance minister of this organization, and I'm making an appeal for money. It's very straightforward. We have no big funder. We don't do advertising. We exist on the work of volunteers and people who donate. It's as straightforward as that. It's very easy to donate. I will put a link in the shortly, but it's in the geopolitical economy site, the International Manifesto site, the new Cold War site. And what I would appeal to people to think about is making a regular monthly donation, not a big one, because that gives us the stability, as I'm sure the economists here will allow. And the other thing is, please like our videos as well as sharing them. Liking apparently triggers the algorithm, which means that more people see the videos, I am told by my fellow vloggers. And if you want to get involved with our work, we'd love to have you more involved. You can volunteer via our sites, and we will certainly be asking you to help in any way that you wish to, and also to contribute. More and more of our seminars are organized by our members. So if you think that we should be doing X or Y, volunteer, join us, and organize a webinar. That's me. I think I've covered everything, haven't I, Radhika?
Okay, no, that's great. Thank you, Alan. So questions. Do I have any raised hands? Anyone? Maybe if there are no immediate questions, I would like to put a question. So could I wonder if I could ask particularly, I mean, Oscar in one sense ended on a slightly positive note, but I think the message for third world countries is very complex. And, you know, obviously, if you are a major commodity exporter, it's one thing. If you're a major commodity importer, it's quite another thing. So perhaps I could ask particularly Oscar, Chandru and Ndongo to reflect on where they think things are going forward. What are the options for third world countries in particular? Anders, you have a question. Maybe you want to add to the question. Go ahead.
Oops. Sorry. Not so much of a question, I think, but I really miss the perspective, because the discussion, at least in Europe and in Scandinavia, is that in a way we like the high energy prices because they dampen the demand for fossil fuels, and we want to escape from using them. So I think many on the left, at least in Scandinavia, see sort of the boycott of Russian gas and oil as a first step to getting away from fossil fuels. So our line has been that sort of we should not sort of try to subsidize and to get lower petrol prices. We should compensate the working class, especially in Norway. We are sort of the Norwegian profits from selling oil and gas these days are just unimaginable. So subsidizing the working class completely is no problem. If you are in Germany, who are not selling fossil fuels, you have to tax the rich. So that's the line politically which I sort of miss in the presentations, that we must think on two fronts at the same time and use this crisis also from an ecological perspective. Thanks.
Thank you. Any responses to that from the speakers? Ingo, go ahead.
Yes, yes, my mic is on. I forgot to mention that in my presentation. Energy prices in just before the commodity super cycle ended, no, actually before the Great Recession, in 2006, 2007, they were even higher than they are now. And the market didn't work. It's not that energy prices are rising and people switch to alternative energies. It would be nice if it was the case, but it hasn't been the case. Actually, they triggered more investment in fossil fuels. They led to overcapacities due to the shale gas boom in the United States, which then ended in my view, the super cycle. So an ecological transition, I think, has to be politically managed, hoping that prices will do it. I don't think it's going to happen. Prices are high right now, but the cry is, give us fossil energy wherever you can find it, and we're willing to pay any price. How to deal with it politically to protect low-income people, that's a different question. How to deal with that, but waiting for high energy prices to lead to substitution to alternative energies, I don't think this will ever going to happen.
Thanks, Ingo. I have Oscar and then James Galbraith.
Anders, you're right. I mean, high energy prices will help the energy transition. But now, what we're looking at in Latin America, at least, is that there is very little energy matrix transition. There are only 2 countries so far that have about 50% renewable energy so far, which are Uruguay and Costa Rica. China is investing like crazy in Argentina, in Brazil, in Colombia, to produce the change of the energy matrix. But then one thing is to change the generation of energy, that can be done with public policies, and that's the way it's being done. The other thing is, how do we convince the consumer to buy an electric car? And that is new, because we have all been looking, at least in Latin America, we have been looking at the change of the energy matrix, thinking that if there's a public policy on the subject, that should bring automatically a shift in the demand of vehicles, and it has not. Even though there are more electric cars now going around, there isn't a general trend like there is in Europe towards electric cars. The idea has not been sold to the public, and part of it has to do with the lack of plugins to recharge the batteries. They don't exist, almost they don't exist. They exist for the very rich. So if you go to the superstore, they have the super plug for your BMW. But the cars that are coming here are either very expensive or the very cheap Chinese that could be sold, but they have nowhere to be plugged except your house. So that's a difficulty. And so there's a long way to go yet. This can speed up the process, but there's a long way to go yet. So it's not so easy. And the other thing is, can the population live with high inflation happily? And I don't think so. High inflation is bad news generally. No?
Absolutely, it's politically destabilizing. James, Anders, Brian, Marika, and Chandru. James, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's been very interesting, important presentations. I have to say, on the question of substitution into new energies, I'm very much on Ingo Schmidt's side here. To the extent that these are going to happen, they require that investments be mobilized to do that. And those investments, which are engineering resources, have to come from somewhere. If the governments involved are instead going to put those resources into the purchase of F-35s, they're not going to have them available to convert to competitive alternate sources of energy, even if those were available in principle. But Ingo also asked for optimistic possibilities, and I want to offer the thought that wars do not go on forever, that this one may well come to an end. It may well be found that agricultural land is not, I mean, somewhat affected by wars, but it's not necessarily devastated by them, and it tends to be something that recovers relatively quickly. And that at the end of the day, it will be found in Europe that it's really not possible to substitute away from the existing infrastructure for the relatively low cost energy sources that have been supplying Europe for many years. I think that's already becoming clear in the way in which, for example, the voices of German industry are being heard, may like it or not like it. but it does not seem to me plausible that the intentions of the political sector will be immune indefinitely to those forces. They never have been in the past. So we could be looking at a different situation in the fall than we are now. The sooner that happens, and the sooner we back off from this world confrontation, the better off we will all be.
Oh, that's very important. Thank you, James. I think Anders, Brian, actually, Anders, I'll come back to you later since you've already spoken. So I'll go to Brian, Malika, Chandru, and Ndongo.
Yeah, hi, everybody. There's so much to talk about, and I did like some of the introductions, I must say. On the price of energy, that's actually due as much to what's happening in Ukraine as it is to the failure of the transition to green energy. Look, the capitalists are fucking useless at everything. Unless the state steps in and slaps them around the face, nothing ever good happens. So look, when they started producing all these windmills, they had a surplus of this kind of electricity. Now, anybody with half a brain knows you need storage. And there are lots of storage solutions. For example, there's something called the Alps in Europe with lots of hidden valleys where you can construct storage dams to take the excess energy produced by the wind farms and store them for when they need it. The Chinese have already developed, and it's not a new technology, high voltage DC cables, which can stretch 4,000 kilometers in all directions, spanning climatic zones and time zones. But you know, there's something called nationalism, how the capitalist view of the world is fractured by national borders. And then, of course, there's the fiasco of the electric vehicles. People have spoken about the charging points. Well, I think one solution is they can convert all public toilets into charging points, given their shortage. The fact of the matter is the government should have stepped in ages ago and said everybody's got to have exchangeable batteries so that you can go into what's the equivalent of a filling station, drop your battery which has no charge and collect a charged battery. But nothing like that has happened. So it's turning into a complete and utter fiasco. And of course, who's going to pay for all these high oil prices and gas prices? The international working class. But it just adds to the pressures on the capitalist system, because I have to tell you, the 2020s is make or break for capitalism. It really is. It's a decade of revolution, the decade in which we have to rescue this planet, the decade where we have to stop a world war between China and the United States. Ukraine is just one feature of it. And I'll finish on this point. And then we have the issue of machine learning and the threat to jobs. And we have a system which can no longer reproduce itself except by impoverishing its working class. I mean, we have a deranged capitalist system and it needs to be overthrown.
Thank you, Brian. I just ask everyone to be brief, because now I see quite a lineup of speakers, so we'd like to hear from everybody. Malika, Chandru, and Ndongo will be the next three. Malika, please.
Yeah, thank you, Radhika. The thing is, in the EU at least, the prevalent trend has been privatization, of course, as we all know. And the energy sector is no exception. So if you combine privatization, which is still carrying on, is still happening, and a very late realization of the need to transition to green energy, the Green Deal, which was just before the pandemic, and that's been taken over by both the pandemic and the war. What we're witnessing right now is, in fact, the reopening of fossil fuel plants. It's ludicrous what's happening. The plants that were shut down fairly recently are being reopened. And so, in fact, it's not only is not renewable energy production taking over, as Anders would wish, and quite correct, but in fact, you have backward moving developments. We're going backward rather than forward, and this is, and of course, I mean, okay, the global South, but on the other hand, at the same time, you have the European South. and of course the Central and Eastern European countries. So you have, a complexity of problems which, don't make really for easy dictums here. Thank you.
So should I come in?
Sorry, I was muted. My mistake. My bad. Go ahead, Chandru, please. Yeah, you're next.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. No, I just briefly, I just wanted to, refer to 2 points to make clear the issue that we should distinguish between our response to what is a set of short-term crises, let us say, or short-term proximate determinants of the current crises, and a longer-term way in which we interpret capitalism. And the first thing I'd like to look at is this whole issue of commodities, and to say that, one is dependence on commodity price increases is something which is positive for the South, is a mistake we've made for too long. I mean, let's face it, the biggest effort to shift the global distribution of income between the North and the South was the ability of countries to take over oil resources, form the OPEC, and do what they did in the 1970s. But we know how that turned around. At one point of time, the real price of oil was lower than what it was prior to the 1973, 74, and 78, 80 oil shocks. And I think the same thing happens, in Latin America. There were good times in Latin America when commodity prices were high, but when commodity price boom ended and we found a lot of left governments suddenly found themselves in a situation where they couldn't actually continue with the social security options that they'd offered during the period when they had the benefit of commodity prices. So I think that finally we need to diversify out of commodity dependence. The only success stories of a transition, which we have really one or maximum two, from being backward to being developed in the period after Japan, that is South Korea and to a certain extent Taiwan, are countries which actually diversified out of, to the extent that they were commodity producers at all, to diversify into manufacturing. The second point, I think, which we need to maybe, I do agree that today the problem is when you look at inflation, we're looking at supply side constraints, and that makes the supply side constraints, which comes out of the way in which capitalism has evolved in recent years, quite crucial. But let's not forget, capitalism is fundamentally a demand constraint system. So as we go forward, independent of whether they get through with these constraints on the supply side or not, what is going to assert itself that in a situation of deeply increasing inequality, where you actually have a situation where the surplus keeps increasing, or the share of surplus in national income keeps increasing, and that's likely to go on with inflation, to actually not take into account the fact that the crisis in capitalism is fundamentally going to come from the fact that it's unable to be able to generate the demand in order to sustain the capacities it creates through the accumulation process. That would remain so while we look at these things in the short term, and I agree with these points, we need to keep into account the fact that you need structural change of a kind that lifts you out of backwardness, and you need to recognize that capitalism is a demand constraint system. Thanks.
Thank you, Chandru. Ndongo, please go ahead.
Thank you, Radhika. 2 quick points. The first about your question about what are the options for, let's say, the global South and especially African countries. I think they are in very difficult situation because most of them need to stabilize their exchange rates, because the inflation exchange rate pass-through effect is really important in many African countries. But the thing is that they need to be in debt in foreign currency for that, and to also be in a position to provide subsidies, etc., to avoid protests, social protests, food riots, etc. But sooner or later, they will have to pay the debt. And we have seen that since the global financial crisis, the yearly debt payments have been increasing. And this will be, I think, the major trend. So at one point, the IMF will come and will say that you have to adjust fiscally. So that debt is not sustainable and have to be somehow cancelled. But the governments have to find, let's say, enough unity to try to advocate that kind of agenda. About the energy transition, I think we have to be nuanced there. I don't think that, for example, in the case of the European Union, they will close, in fact, the agenda of fossil fuels. We have seen with what happened in the war in Ukraine, they all say that we want to, let's say, get rid of our dependence vis-a-vis Russia. And we have seen some countries like Italy, for example, signing, let's say, agreements with an oil and a gas producing country like Algeria. This will continue. The other thing is also that the way the European Union wants to implement its agenda of green transition somehow involves a kind of ecological imperialism, in the sense that there is this new scramble for what they call green hydrogen, which I think relies a lot on, let's say, water resources. And the European Union have a number of projects, in fact, in different countries about this green hydrogen, which is seen as a kind of, let's say, the new green energy, which will change everything. You see, and I think that in that context, it could be really challenging for African countries, because those projects of green transition could be made at the expense of African countries. That means creating new forms of dependency. And there's also one issue people talked about, is about the SDRs. And the developed countries do not need the SDRs, the standard living rights. So one possible use is how can they invest those SDR to de-risk the Western investment in, let's say, such risky places such as Africa. So I think that we have to be much more, let's say, careful about the so-called green transition, especially from the European Union perspective.
Thanks, Dongo. I have Rosemary, Lynn, William, and Simon. Please go ahead. Rosemary.
Yes, hi, everybody. Hi, Radhika. I'm on, there's a bit of an echo because I'm on a, just a minute, I got to shut off one thing here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I can't hear you. Okay, I'll just put my question. I'm sorry, I'm on two different machines. My question is about basic income. I had put it into the chat. The question is to any panelists who would care to answer. What do you think of the impact? What would the impact of the institution of a global institution of a basic income be on the current situation? I'm thinking that it has the potential to socialize labor and because it'll also dampen social unrest. So that if the capitalist class realizes that, perhaps they will institute it. And then in the long term, I'm just wondering how that would work out.
Thanks, Rosemary. I'll take two more questions and then we'll revert to the panelists briefly and then take some more questions. So I will have Lynn. Please go ahead, Lynn.
I was thinking of the slide by Nagoko. I think of all these factors that are happening at the same time that are kind of causing a perfect storm. And, you know, the COVID and the Russia war and everything. So what I was thinking is from the very start of COVID is that we should instigate heat recovery ventilators in all public buildings. And this takes down the constant threat of COVID much more. You can control the times, the amount of air circulation depending upon the people in the room indoors. This will help a lot in the winter time or in cold environments and worrying about another surge of COVID. And then you can also have UV filters, which filter out the virus. So that will help the economy some. And then the thought also of microgrids and distributive generation as opposed to transmission and large scale transmission energy, which is much more, less is more, you know, and doing things small scale. I think that's what the virus has taught us.
Okay, thanks.
This is used for air travel also. I hear there's good ventilation in air travel, but there needs to be the UV filters and better. I'm not vaccinated, so I won't air travel until I know that it's going to be safe.
Thank you very much. William, please go ahead.
Thank you for taking my question. This is for Michael. Michael, being a UMKC guy, this kind of relates to the Kelton world. I guess my question is, if you believe in the deficit doesn't matter and we're seeking to get inflation at the 2% level with perhaps full employment, do you believe in that? And how would you reduce inflation to that prime number of around 2%?
Thank you, William. And I'll just piggyback one question to that, both for Michael and for other speakers as well. The proponents of modern monetary theory are always, talking, and those who broadly agree with them are always talking about how it is important not to raise interest rates, which of course one agrees with. But what is one to do about the fact that low interest rates have led to the present, well, to a series of financial bubbles, and today, as many speakers have pointed out, are actually contributing to inflation. So I just want to throw that out and go to the speakers at this point. Who would like to respond? Maybe Michael, since you were named, you can go first.
You're muted, Michael.
Thanks for reminding me. The question about modern monetary theory and deficits is, what are the deficits being run for? Well, for the last 12 years, they've been run mainly to finance the financial sector, asset prices, stocks and bond market. Monetary theory, Stephanie and all the rest of us at Kansas City assumed that the deficits would be spent into the economy to help labor and employment. But that's not how things have happened under the Democratic or Republican parties. The deficits are spent into the economy not to help labor, not to increase employment, but basically to reward their campaign contributors in the finance and insurance and real estate sector. So if you're having the deficit spent not on increasing productive spending, not on increasing employment, but meanwhile, you're having the tax system and including the healthcare system drain money out of the economy, then that's really shrinking shrinking labor's disposable income after paying its financial charges and insurance charges and rent. So you have to look at a much more complicated approach, a multi-sectored approach, instead of just deficits versus the economy. The economy is a lot of different parts. Only part of the economy is the employment part. The biggest part of money and credit is all spent on asset prices, on real estate, stocks and bonds, not on building more plant and equipment and factories to employ more labor.
Thanks, Michael. So I think what you're saying is that the only way of doing that would be to essentially either highly regulate or nationalize the financial sector.
You're right.
Thank you. I just wanted you to name that. That's all. Okay. All right. So any other speakers would like to respond to the questions that were put earlier? If not, I will go to Simon, Vasilis, and Gary. So Simon, please go ahead.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Since someone mentioned Samir, I've been thinking about delinking and if what we're seeing could also be like on a hypothetical level as the global South countries start to delink, that this would cause serious problems in the imperialist core, and that the consequences of that will be really pushed onto the working class, and as such, any sort of political organizing on behind a single campaign between the periphery and the imperialist core would be rather difficult, because the liberation struggles of the periphery would, in sort of the short term, cause the fall of living standards in the imperialist core. I don't know if I'm just completely off track here. And the other thing is, technology is all fine and good for sort of to fight climate change, but I think we're missing also social organizational issues, and I'm thinking particularly the nuclear family, which has been sold as this like liberal freedoms, blah blah blah. Whereas I see it more as increasing the number of units of consumption.
Okay, thank you very much. I have Vasilis and then Gary.
Thanks, Radhika. It's a practical question I have, really, not theoretical, practical, because these questions that concern me most. I wrote it down in the chat box. I don't know if anybody noticed it, because there's a lot of flow in the chat box going on. Well, this is a question. In Europe, I don't know which panel is going to answer, but feel free to step in and try to answer it. But my question is this: in Europe, we have the European Treaties. These treaties are neoliberal, but very specifically, very, very peculiarly neoliberal. These are ordoliberal treaties. They're drawn from the German-Austrian ordoliberal tradition. They're imposed on each member state. So every EU member state, for example, is subject to fair competition policy. If we want to switch from supply-led economics to demand-led economics within the European Union, we cannot do it. It's just not, it's a constraint. We are constrained by the treaties. And because, of course, the movement is developed in an uneven way. I mean, you may have a big movement in Italy or in Greece or in Spain or in Germany, unlikely, yeah. But, you come to power, you don't know how to deal with the treaties. You're constrained. So you cannot nationalize, for example, in a way. I put it in the chat box somewhere. I can come back to that, but don't want to be long. We're already run out of time. So this is my question. It's the European Treaties question.
Thank you, Vasilis. And Gary, please go ahead.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Just on that, I mean, I've thought for a long time that the first step in uniting Europe into a future socialist Europe is to break up the European community. It's the only way you're going to have the freedom to do anything, because the Brussels-based system is designed entirely to defend capitalism. But three other points. One is, now is the time, if we're thinking at a trade unionist level, at the level of the struggle in the streets, it's time to be thinking about and proposing COLA clauses, cost of living clauses, and fight to keep the effective inflation, or at least some of the effective inflation, off the workers' backs. So I think that kind of practical defensive struggle needs to happen. And the other thing is, I'm wondering what do you think of the prospects of China delinking and of China and Russia and others being able to form an alternative currency system to break up the long system of United States using IMF and military power and the World Bank to ram its own self-interest down the throats of almost every country in the world, or threaten them with economic catastrophe. Is there any chance that these first steps by China and others, what are the prospects there of kind of breaking that up? I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. I think we will, I'm going to bring this to a close now. I'm going to let Anders get his question in one final question, and then we'll go to the speakers roughly in the order in which they spoke. So Anders, please go ahead.
So I don't have actually a question, or maybe in a way, because I think, let me be very brief. So the working people all over the world needs a stable climate. So we have to design a climate policy that will benefit the poor. And I can only point you to an article by John Bellamy Foster in Monthly Review 2013, which is called James Hansen and the Exit Strategy from Fossil Fuel Society. And that's sort of an outline of a climate policy where you tax fossil fuels and you give the income to the poor. In a global setting, you will tax international transport and you will send all the money to the global south. So that's because without such a policy, the left will be politically paralyzed when when fossil fuels prices are rising, as they should. Take the example of France and the Yellow Vests. So the bourgeoisie is dead scared of the Yellow Vest. That was a major social uprising, but the left in France had nothing to say because they had not devised a policy where rising prices benefited the poor. And that's sort of key in all our debates. I'll stop there. Thanks, Radhika.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to go to each of the speakers for any final comments and responses to the questions that you have heard, any that you wish to respond to. So I'll begin with Chandru. So go ahead, Chandru. Any reactions? Oh, and in your case, Chandru, if I may just again piggyback one final question from me. I was very intrigued when you said, rightly, of course, I know that, but when you said, capitalism is a demand constrained system, which is absolutely right. But then what does that imply for you? Does it imply that therefore all episodes of inflation are temporary, etc.?
Okay, so let me respond to that first. Okay, what I'm trying to say is that if you say that we are stuck in a situation in which supply side constraints are taking us down the path of inflation to a certain extent, partly because of asymmetries in terms of responsiveness of supply relative to responsiveness of demand, post-COVID, etc., then yes, and in a short-term sense, it is true. But in the final analysis, you're going to be in a situation where you are going to be in a world in which you cannot, it's not price adjustments which are going to be central to the functioning of capitalism and to its crises. It's output adjustments, in particular employment adjustments, that you would be caught in unemployment equilibrium, which would become more important than inflation, I would think, because of the fact that the response to inflation itself would be of a kind which actually does that, which is what happened when Paul Volcker did what he did at the time of, and possibly, God knows, maybe the Fed is going to do that again. But as of now, the world is different because of the destabilizing effects that would have on financial markets because of years of cheap money having created a structure which, if you unwind those kinds of investment, it's going to fall back. The other point I want to make is to link things about delinking and supposing we say that, okay, in principle, and of course of China, can China and Russia, etc., constitute a new axis for hegemony in the world system? Now, the problem is that whether we consider, developing countries in general, particularly, of course, so-called emerging and frontier markets, they have all over this period built up large volumes of legacy financial capital within their jurisdictions, within their borders. Deciding to delink means you're going to take a period of time when, as much as in the 1980s under Mitterrand, France had to face it, you're going to face a huge outflow of capital. We're already seeing it. Whenever there is trouble anywhere in the world, money flows out from this, as mentioned by Dango also. So I think that you must have governments which are willing to say that, listen, there's going to be a period of pain, during which period of time, because we want to create for ourselves the domestic policy space to do what we right, we're actually going to face a situation where this legacy foreign capital is going to just vote with their money. They're just going to walk out Okay, and you cannot be, you need to take the social sanction that you can get to do that and do it, as opposed to saying that we will win the social sanction, come to power, but when we come to power, we'll do exactly what international finance wants to do. Unfortunately for us, in a lot of third world countries, or even non-third world, Greece, etc., that's what happens, that you come to power on the basis of a set of slogans which gives you social sanction to do things which you don't do because you're afraid of foreign finance. And I think the degree of integration of China and Russia and so on with the global market makes it difficult for them as well to de-link in a fundamental sense. It would be a complex game in which they'll have to try and reserve sections of the global market for themselves if they are not going to get into crisis, unless they have governments which are going to say that, listen, we're going to have a period in which you're going to take some pain in order to be able to create an environment in which, using domestic policy space, we'll pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps rather than being dependent on others. But you need specific kinds of politics and governments for that.
Yeah, you need the political consent for that. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chandru. Ndongo, I have you next anyway, so please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. This is really important, this issue about delinking. The thing is that the more we reflect about it, we sense the need for the Global South to delink, but at the same time, there is this issue of scale. Can nation states delink, or nation states of what kind of economic size? I think for example, most countries of the Global South, individually delinking would be very, very difficult, or at least it would imply huge costs. I could give one concrete example. In West Africa, Mali is a country which has a socialist tradition, etc. Recently, they have allied with the Russian to use the French military, because the French military, let's say, started to occupy the northern Mali under the pretext of fighting jihadism and so on. And this jihadism has been brought in northern Mali following the war of aggression of NATO against Libya, you see. And now the Malian government, in fact, the elected government did not make any attempt to get rid of the terrorists in northern Mali. There had been a coup d'etat, a military coup, following the frustrations by the population and so on. And the military government decided to work with the Russian, and they get rid of the French. Now the French military is out of Mali. But the sanction they took is that Mali is a member of a monetary union, the CFA franc monetary union in West Africa. The French, using, let's say, satellite governments like mine, Senegal, and Cote d'Ivoire, they decided to cut off the Malian government from its access to its own regional central bank, including the domestic financial system. That's the way they found to cut off Mali, let's say, from the regional financial system and generally from the international financial system. So that means that if you do not have the appropriate size, it's really difficult, because dominant powers could use, let's say, neighboring countries to inflict more pain. We have been talking about the sanction against Russia. Mali is doing the same, and Mali is a landlocked country. And normally you could not, legally speaking, let's say, close trade borders with a landlocked country. But that has been the fate of Mali since at least the beginning of the year. So the linking, why not? But the thing is, you have to have a different kind of let's say, regional integration and strong, let's say, South-South alliances to make it successful.
Great, that's an important point. Thank you, Ndongo. I have next Marika. Please go ahead.
Yes, I mean, picking up Dongo's last point about the linking, which is, as he said, yes, go ahead, but you must have other things in place before you actually pull the trigger, makes me think back to the Euro crisis and the idea of exiting the Euro by Greece at that time. And that's what became clear at, you know, we sort of got very close to the edge of the cliff. And that's when we realized, well, we'll be just falling down the cliff, free fall. Anyway, the points that I wanted to make very quickly is, one, I didn't actually raise this point in my presentation because of time constraints, but there is what is known as inflation inequality. In other words, different There's a rich-poor inflation gap because of the different spending patterns. And that goes to the question basic income. Basic income would put a floor to, if you like, the inflation gap. And alongside that, minimum wages. There are, in other words, policy tools that one can turn to in order to deal with the inflation gap, inflation inequality, which is hurting the sections of the population more than others. That's one point I wanted to come back to. The other point is, personally, I feel that this raise in interest rates is a message. It's the political implication of the inflation that we're living, the inflationary period we're living through right now. And it's a message addressed to the unions or anyone thinking of fighting for higher wages, and B, to indebted countries like Italy or Greece, which are going to find it very difficult to finance their budgets and to refinance their debt. This is a message for them. You know, it's a sort of roundabout way of saying, guys, just make sure you don't go to the market very often, because the markets are becoming expensive for you. And so to me, the raising of interest rates right now, on the other hand, a lot of forward guidance has been given to the financial markets, which is okay. I mean, we don't want financial instability to sort of explode, financial stability to explode, but the markets have been forewarned, they have been warned, whereas those who have to, who are dealing with wages being eaten away by inflation, or the debt will, the real value of the debt is actually coming down, but countries, nation states have to refinance their debt, and therefore they're up against the higher rates. The other point is raised by Vasilis Fouskas. No, you cannot nationalize easily. That's definite. In fact, a lot of pressure is being applied to privatize in the European Union. But on the other hand, you don't have to privatize at this. I mean, for example, in Greece right now, the New Democracy government has privatized, put onto the market a larger share of the public corporation, the so-called public corporation, public electricity energy corporation, and you don't need to do that. This is a political choice. And so the conservative government is choosing to privatize even more a corporation that is public by name only. And the last point, yes, what Dongo said, let's break up the European Union, but you can't do that from one day to the next. You have to have something to put in its place, or to, some kind of alternative scheme. And so long as, unfortunately, we in Greece realize that such a scheme simply does not exist right now. So let's get let's fortify the left. Let's get a stronger left and go forward with more radical ideas and pronunciation. Thanks.
Thank you, Malika. There are so many huge debates in what you're saying, but this is such critically important questions. I have next Ingo for your final statements. Ingo, please.
Yes. I will pick up the debate about delinking and about green transition. And since I focused on geopolitics, war, and energy, I'd like to remind people wars are not just between countries, they're also class wars. And social movements are typically the first victim of war. So I talked about the commodity supercycle starting with the war on Iraq or against Afghanistan. And at the time, if people remember, that was still the heyday, despite the end of the dot-com bubble, of the movement for alternative globalization. And in terms of delinking, kind of it has been said by Ndongo, by Malika, and I agree with that, you just can't pull the plug. In the movement for alternative globalization, there were ideas how to create a different kind of globalization. There were also ideas already at the time, of course, by environmentalists that a crucial part of that would be the regionalization of economic activity, particularly one that requires huge amounts of energy to just move stuff around. So if we are hearing about supply chain problems these days, I think it's crucial for the left not to say, well, hopefully we can get back to China delivers everything for cheap to make Western consumers happy. There needs to be a considerable part of moving production elsewhere and changing the ways of production, by the way. It's not reopening the steel mills in the Rust Belt of the United States. They're not coming back. And the problem we are facing here is that just very recently, there was, if you will, a Green New Deal light or even super light in the election campaigns of Joe Biden in the US, of the German Social Democrats, of the Greens in Germany. And as weak as that was, even that is now kind of being swept away by the war, and now it's all about fossil fuels and delivering tanks and missiles. Again, so I think it's crucial into moving forward, kind of to regain some of those debates and make those connections, if you will, between Green New Deals within countries and trying to tie them together in a vision of an alternative ecological globalization. That's my, admittedly very abstract, but that's the best I can come up with at this point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingo. Michael, I have you next.
Well, I think everybody's in agreement that inflation is going to be increasing and accelerating. Marika used the word inflation inequality. And my point is that the greatest inflation inequality is going to be between the US and industrial countries on the one hand, the creditor countries, and the debtor countries on the other, because their currency is going to go down. And not only is the price of fuels and food going to be increasing, but also the exchange rate will make all imported goods much more expensive, and there's going to be a real squeeze there. So I guess the next meeting we should have on what are you going to do about the inflation, and what are the alternatives going to be? I don't think it's very helpful to talk about green alternatives. Because the Green parties are the most anti-environmental parties there are today. There's a war party. And the great increase in inflation is the military. Nobody's taking into account the military pollution from all of these aircrafts, from all the bombing, from all of the fighting. And as long as the Green parties are the pro-military party, you can hardly give them any credit at all for claiming that they're for environmentalism. They're the enemies of the environment politically in Europe, certainly in Germany in particular, where the Greens are the super hawks. So the solution has to be not only economic, it has to be political, it has to be military. And I don't see how the squeeze on the global South countries and on the industrial nations can be solved without a basic restructuring. And there's one I should have added when there was a question about MMT before and deficit spending. I should have added that the Democrats have accepted the Trump policy. Biden has kept all of the Trump tax cuts for the rich. Nobody who developed MMT had any idea that creating government spending to help employment was going to be meaning, well, we can print the money and we don't need to tax rich. We can have a regressive tax. We can shift the tax off of the high income, high wealth people onto labor. That's so that Trump and the Biden administration, the Democrats, have made a travesty of everything that we've been talking about MMT.
That's great, Michael. You were already proposing another session. James Galbraith in the session is in the chat is also almost doing so. So perhaps we will have another one. Precisely on what you said is what is to be done. How is delinking actually accomplished, if at all, etc. I think these are the key questions. But let me go finally now to Oscar and let him have the final word, and then we'll bring this amazingly rich discussion to a close, unfortunately, but all good things have to end. So Oscar, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Now I was just thinking
listening to Anders. Anders is right. The world as a world needs to produce less. But what we're having now is one particular country overconsumed in massive amounts, which is the one country that is most borrowed in the world. It has 100% of its GDP in debt, and it has the largest GDP in the world. And that is financed by the rest of us who have adjustment policy. Now, that doesn't make any sense. We need to reactivate our economies, but that means two things. We need to be clear that in the South, we are not homogeneous, the same way that in the North, you are not homogeneous. And the fact that we are so heterogeneous in the South means that it is possible that policies that are required for Africa, who is so highly dependent on food imports, are different from policies in South America, that is not so highly dependent on food imports. Or in any case, the food imports in South America come from South America, basically from Argentina and Brazil. So, so it's a different scheme. And the other thing is, if consumption was to be reduced in the richer countries, let's have one thing clear. The rich countries have a total population of what, 600 million people, roughly? The rest of the world, which is 6,400 million people, need to consume more, eat better. That's the poor, no? So you have to, those 600 millions need to consume less. The world will produce less on the whole, even if the other ones are consuming more. We have to get rid of these artificial fertilizers and the chemicals, and go back to basics, no? Go back to basics, go back to increasing productivity in the natural ways, and restoring consumption, not restoring, having consumption at normal rates, and not with credit. I mean, the expansion of credit has done horrors to consumption. I mean, the only way you can explain the US external deficit is because of the amount of credit there is inside the US. And that has to be, I think, that has to be reduced. The problem there is that you literally have a class struggle. I mean, the financial sector in the US is not going to allow any reduction of credit because that's their business. And now you have a strong financial sector almost everywhere. So we have a problem there. But let's keep in mind that we're different, we're heterogeneous, and that poor people need to produce more to eat better and to produce more naturally. And rich people need to consume a lot less so that the world balances out. Otherwise, we're going to continue having this imbalance that is leading us nowhere. No? Right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, folks. So as I say, all good things have to come to an end. I really feel so enlightened. Even as somebody who's been thinking about inflation for a long time, I feel I've learned an enormous amount today. So thank you very much. Perhaps we will have in the future a follow-up on precisely the larger, more fundamental questions that are raised by the current episode of inflation about the capitalism and its future, and of course, the future of, well, most of humanity. Having said that, I will bring this to a close. Thank you all very much for attending. Thank you for staying for so long. And thank you to all the speakers. And finally, also thank you to Ingo, who helped me to organize this. So wonderful. See you all sometime soon. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thanks.